I have access.
Yeah, so my presentation today is what do they want? And I give this presentation in various forms to people who are experienced developers like most of us are. And I've also given a version of this presentation to college classes who are students who are learning about software development and getting started. So it's a really great topic. Like George said in the description on the website, it's a soft skill, but it's something that I think a lot of developers have difficulty with, and it's something that you can definitely get better at, and it'll make the whole software project go much more smoothly. So let's get started. First thing, I'll do a very quick slide. I won't spend a lot of time talking about who I am in case there are some of you watching that don't know who I am. So this is my family here. I have a son and daughter and my son-in-law and daughter-in-law. So that's the 6 of us now. I started off with 2 kids. I ended up with 4 kids and they're all great. That's my dog, Jack. That's one of my interests is keeping my old 1969 Ford Bronco running. So that's uh, one of I like to say I don't get too many toys, so I like to make them good ones. And that's my wife, Lori. One of our interests for sure, and certainly before the pandemic, and we'll get back there soon, is going to the island of Kauai. So we enjoy spending time on Kauai. So I'm the president of J Street Technology, and we are a company of about a dozen developers here in the Seattle area. I've been a Microsoft Access MVP since 2006, specifically with the product of Access. And I'm the author of several articles on business. So I like writing about the business of software development. So you could find those on our website if you choose. I've spoken at conferences. I love traveling and speaking at conferences all around the world. And like I said, my interest in Kauai runs deep. And so Lori and I actually wrote a little guide to the island of Kauai, and it's available on Amazon. So you could always check it out if you like. I don't make a lot of money on it. If you buy one, I think I will make approximately $1. So it's not going to be my retirement gig, but it's really fun to share our love of that island and some of our favorite things around the island. So let me talk to you a little bit about J Street. Like I said, we're in the Seattle area, about a dozen people. We've designed and built hundreds of systems. I don't even know how many hundreds at this point, but it's a lot. And we've worked with hundreds of clients, obviously, because most clients we do one system for. Some of them we do multiple systems. There's a few logos of companies you may recognize, and obviously we've done many more systems for companies that you would not recognize the name of. So let's get into this. Software development projects consist of a bunch of different phases or steps or stages or whatever you want to call them. You have to discover the requirements. You have to build a plan with a budget and a timeline, or at least you should do that. You have to obviously design the database. That's the foundation of your project. You have to create some kind of specifications, sketches, hopefully, to kind of guide what you're going to be doing. You have to construct the system. That's the actual coding. A lot of people think that software development means programming, right? We all maybe think that sometimes, but notice that that's just one line in this whole process. We have to test internally first, and then of course users have to test, hopefully, to work out the kinks before we go live with the system. Obviously, we resolve any issues that are found. We have to deploy the code, so deployment is a whole step in itself. Support and maintain the system after it's live. So obviously, it's not going to be perfect on the first day. It never is. And so you have to understand how it's working and get feedback from the users and maintain a production system as well. And of course, there's project status reports that we have to produce throughout. So that one sort of covers the whole timeline where we're delivering communications about the project. So all that's well and good, but what today we're going to talk about is the very first step. So I wanted to put it in context. Here are all the things we need to do, but what we're going to focus on today is that very first step. If you don't get that first step right, the rest of these steps are not going to go well for you. So that's what we're talking about today. How are we discovering requirements? And I say the word discover because, and we call it a discovery process, because the requirements, it sounds funny, but the requirements are already there. You just need to find out what they are. So every business has pain. The reason they're coming to you for help is because they want to make something better. They want to do something with the software they have, or maybe they need a whole brand new system, and you have to figure out what is it they actually want. And that's a harder process than it sounds. It's not as simple as just asking them what they want, because they can't always articulate it clearly. Um, any questions so far about how this fits in the overall process that we're going to be discussing? Okay, I'll move on. So what I always like to say is, what's going to happen before we even start? Here's the thing. You often won't know the company that you're dealing with. This happens to us all the time. People come to us and they say, yeah, I'm with so-and-so company, well, ABC company, and here's what we do. And I say, oh, I've never heard of that company, because there's hundreds of thousands of companies out there. And of course, I haven't heard of all of them. And sometimes I don't even know their industry. This happens rarely, but there are definitely times where a company will call and they'll say, we do such and such. And I always think, I guess maybe if you had to put me on the spot, I would have said there was a company that does that, but I would have had, I would never have come up with it, on a multiple choice test of, do you think this industry exists? Uh, Example is like, one of my fun ones that I like to use as an example is, we had a company come to us and say that we're an ammonia cooperative. And I was like, okay, I know what ammonia is and I know what a cooperative is, but I've never heard of an ammonia cooperative. And it turns out that they're a buying group for ammonia, which is the purest form of nitrogen that you can move around, and nitrogen is used in fertilizer. So these were all a bunch of farmers that got together and formed a shareholders cooperative to secure their supply of fertilizer. I'm like, wow, did not know that industry existed. Um, so there you go. Don't even know that it even exists. So that is, you're at a disadvantage because they know their company and they know their industry, but you don't. So now what do we do to solve that, right? Well, you always start with their website. Everyone has a website, and I'm amazed at how many developers will go and talk to a customer without having at least looked at their website to see what the heck is it they even do. So that takes some study. You can go through it and try to get an idea of what's happening. You can familiarize yourself with their industry. So you go online, you look around and see, well, what kind of company is this? What is the industry? And find out as much as you can. Even if you can't find too much, you need to start writing down questions. And I'll have a list of questions later where you can kind of prime the pump and start having a conversation about someone, about what their company does and what their industry does. So now we start getting into, that's before you discover. Now we're in the process of discovery and we start working. And again, go ahead and unmute and dive in if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will just continue talking, and I'll come up for air occasionally and ask if there's any questions, but please don't be shy if there's anything that you'd like to ask. All right. We at J Street Technology, we have a name for our discovery phase. We call it the architectural framework. Uh, you can make up your own name for it. Don't use mine because I made that one up. But what most companies call it is the discovery phase. And you can certainly say, we're going to do a discovery phase before we do the actual development. I highly recommend this approach. And the reason is that if you don't do a discovery phase, it's really going to be hard to identify the scope of the project. And nobody cares about the scope of the project because that's just a word. What they really care about is the cost of the project. They really want to know, how much is the project going to cost in both dollars and in time. And the only way we've figured out over time to make an accurate estimate is to do a discovery phase, which again, we call architectural framework. The architectural framework has three main deliverables. We build a database design, and we actually implement it in SQL Server, and we draw a diagram of it. We do a screen flow. So we build this usually in Visio, and we build a screen flow and we color code the modules and we lay out how big each screen is going to be. For example, we use search shirt sizes. So there's a medium, there's an extra large, there's a small, and we figure out how much effort each screen or report is going to take just on a general shirt size model. Shirt sizes don't go up linearly, they go up, basically they go up exponentially. So an extra large is much bigger than a large, and a large is much bigger than a medium. And so we have a whole spreadsheet that we use to help our estimating. So that's part of what we build during the discovery. And then the third piece is the estimates, and it's basically a project plan. And so we'll put together estimates of how big the project is going to be and how long we think it's going to take. This is a screenshot of a real one that we did that was $145,000. But this, you could take a zero off of this or add a zero, and this would all be the very similar process. So the size of the project doesn't really matter. It's just we just go through this routine with each time we do a discovery phase. So now let's talk about having the conversation with the customer and trying to uncover the requirements that they have. Here's one thing I'll say, and this is true. I found this to be true in my life, and I found it to be true in software development, and that is listening is so much more important than talking. Many consultants want to get in there and start immediately talking about what they are going to do and how awesome they are. And they're going to say, here's all the systems we've done in the past. Here's what we can do. I have some cool ideas. And they just end up filling up the space with their words instead of listening. It's silence that's actually really powerful in a conversation with a client. So I'll ask a question and then I'll wait. A lot of times we're uncomfortable with silence. So people will say, well, what were you thinking? Or what do you need to do in the area of invoices? And then instead of waiting for the answer, they say, because what I was thinking is, and then they start talking and they start filling in that silence instead of letting the customer say what's on their mind. You have to give people a chance to process the question and come up with an answer. And that is a thing that is an area that I find that many consultants are lacking in, either because they think they know the answers, so they want to jump in, or they're uncomfortable with the silence, or they're just uncomfortable with the whole process and they're nervous and they want to talk, or they're worried about landing the project, or I don't know why. But all of those reasons are there, but it's important to just wait and listen for an answer. And I use silence very powerfully at times in conversations. And I just think, I'm going to ask the question or I'm going to say something. And then I'm just going to, in my mind, I just think 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. And your person you're talking to will not let it go further than that. And they'll fill in that gap with what they're thinking. And you can find out a lot more about what you need to know. Like I said, you don't try to impress them with what you know. They're already talking to you. This is one of those cases where you need to be able to take yes for an answer. Just take it in. Don't try to sell them anymore. They're already talking to you. They're already having some kind of discovery conversation with you. So let them talk. They'll use jargon. They'll say, oh, well, we need to be able to generate TPS reports or whatever it is. And they'll use an acronym or some jargon. Jot it down, make a note of it if you don't know what it is. And then if you need to ask them what it means, you can do that. And I have something about that too, but say it back to them. So whenever I hear jargon or even just terminology, like for example, does your client call their clients customers? Do they call them accounts? Do they call them clients? Whatever the word they use for their people that they work for, use it back with them. If they constantly say customer and you keep telling them that they're clients, it's going to be a disconnect. You're not going to gel with them because you're not speaking their same language. So try to be a chameleon and don't try to force them to use some different terminology. Use it back with them and say it back to them. One thing I'll say again, back on the jargon, sometimes something comes up and you don't know what it means and you feel a little embarrassed. Like you're thinking, I should probably know what that term means, but I feel embarrassed about asking. And I tell this to my students when I do guest lectures at the college level, but I'll tell all of us as well. Is I have a key phrase to add on to that sentence. If you say well, what does IRS mean? And they go, duh, Internal Revenue Service. And you're like, oh, that was stupid. Of course it's Internal Revenue Service, right? What you can say, and this is a little trick, you can say, now, when you're talking about IRS, how does that apply in this context? Just add the words "in this context" to the end of any question that you think might be a stupid question, and that'll smooth it across. Because if you say, now, what do you mean by IRS in this context? Then they're not going to say, duh, it's Internal Revenue Service. What they're going to say is, well, here's the thing, is we have to report to the IRS, the taxes or the revenue or whatever. And you're like, oh, of course, that's what they mean. So in this context is a good way to soften a question. Or I don't know, if you care about saving face, which by the way, I've gotten over it a long time ago. If I ask a question, I'm okay with having it seem like a dumb question because I'm there to learn. But if you're having a problem with that or you want it to go a little smoother, add "in this context." Just a little tip. Um, Sometimes we hear requirements because our customer doesn't know something is possible. This used to happen a lot in the older days with reports. People would say, well, I need a report that shows such and such. And I'm thinking, actually, you could just have that on a web page. Like, it doesn't need to be a report. So be careful about people saying, like, well, I need something, I need to show something on a screen so that I can enter it into this other system. Well, they might not know that it's possible to have an API into that system, and you could programmatically do it. So listen for the requirements and start jotting down areas where you could say something like, if you could do that in this other way, how would you think? Like, would that work for you? And they might say, wow, I didn't even know you could do that. And then Yahtzee, now you have something that you can use that is a value add that they didn't even know that was possible. So that's what I like to watch for, and make sure that you're not just jotting down what they say they want. You need to understand why they want it, because if you know why they want it, then maybe there's another way that would be even better. So let's now get into asking questions. So what kinds of questions can we ask when we're just getting started with a new company? And again, like I said earlier, you might not know the company very well or even their industry very well. Here's my favorite question to start off. Well, actually, even earlier than this question, I always make people sometimes laugh when I say this, but when I first meet a client, um, and it's part of the first initial consult, which is before the full discovery phase, but this is just when we're getting to know them. My favorite question to ask when I say, hi George, I'm Armen from J Street Technology, I'm responding to your inquiry. And he goes, oh, hi Armen, thanks for calling me back. I go, sure George, so tell me what's going on. Like, that's my question. That's my first question. That's a highly technical question. You need to really get it right. So what's going on, George? And it sounds funny, but that's an open-ended question where they get to fill in whatever they're feeling and whatever's going on. So this is another open-ended question. Tell me how your business works, and especially, and you don't have to say it right at the same time, but you can add in, how do you guys make money? Now, this might seem like kind of a weird question, but here's the thing. All businesses and even all nonprofits, a church, a nonprofit, a business, anything, money is the thing that moves through that organization, and they need to have a way of bringing it in, and then they spend it on things. That's the end of story. So how do you make money is a way for you to quickly cut to the chase and get to what is it that the company does, and that way you can have your whole conversation be mindful of the flow of money and what they're trying to do.
Hey, Armen.
Yeah.
Just a thought on that. Years ago, I worked with a guy who did an engagement at AMC Theaters, And he asked that same question. And the response is, we do not make money on movies. That we make our money selling popcorn.
Right.
Which changes the whole approach.
That is a great comment. I've heard that before as well, that movie theaters really make almost nothing. They break even. If you talk to Costco and you ask them about their roasted chickens, they'll say, we lose money on every single roasted chicken that we sell. But you all know that if you go into a Costco, where are the roasted chickens? They're at the back of the store where you have to walk past everything to get to them. So that is what's cloud classically as a loss leader. And so for the movie business, the actual renting of the film and buying it and selling the ticket for it is not where they make their money. That's exactly right. So if you know how the organization makes money, or in the case of a nonprofit, how they bring in revenue, because everyone always thinks that nonprofits don't make money, but you bet they do. They bring in revenue in a variety of ways. Then you can know where the important areas to talk about are, like where can we make things more efficient, because we want to be able to have you either make more money or save on expenses. Those are the 2 points of return on investment that are often brought up, but I'll bring up some more later, so hold tight. Here's another question. This gets to pain, because I often say that custom software development is basically pain relief. What is your current system not doing that it should be doing? Now, notice that I put the word should in there because that's a value judgment. That gets them to open up and say, well, you know what it would really be nice to do, or what it should do? And they start telling you about their hopes and dreams for the system instead of getting too technical about it. What should it do? So again, open-ended question, and you listen hard and you start taking notes and you think, okay, where are the areas of pain that we could possibly alleviate? And then another one about pain, annoyance. What's so annoying about your system? What do you just hate about it? And they'll often say things like, one of the common things we'll get is, we have to enter the same information into 2 or 3 different places, and we never know which place is right, and they might not be in sync, and it causes us to make mistakes, and the customers get angry with us and we get embarrassed. Okay, that's annoying. So let's talk about how we can synchronize things or consolidate data so that doesn't happen. Here's another ROI question that starts getting more toward return on investment, ROI. How much time per week does so-and-so? By the way, for some reason, I always use Sally as an example name, so forgive me. For a number, I always use 17 for some reason, and for a name, I use Sally. How much time per week does Sally spend doing that activity? Because they'll talk about, well, we have this gal, Sally, and she works on such and such every day. And I go, well, how much time? Because what I'm wanting to find out is, where are the areas that people spend their time on that they really should not be doing, because that's better for a machine to do than a human. We always like to say, never let a human do a machine's job. And so anything that's rote, that's repetitive, that's the same thing over and over, is not really good for a human to do. That's not the best and highest purpose for a human brain. And then also about connections. This is a really big scope area that often is missed. You could go into a customer and they could say, we need this, this, and this, and you go, great, great, great. That sounds fine. And then at the end of it, or during the middle of the project, they'll say, well, of course this needs to update accounting automatically. And you're like, what now? And you never asked about connected systems, because maybe they just assumed it, or they forgot to say, or you didn't flesh out the details. You need to find out which other systems are involved. These days, very few systems are completely self-contained. They may need to send an email. They may need to send a text. They may need to do a word merge, or export to Excel, or import from Excel, or have an API to a CRM system like Salesforce or Dynamics. So you have to ask these questions. Why? Well, one is you want to know the requirements, obviously. But the second reason is these types of connections are disproportionately difficult. They might only be one line item on a plan, but that line item might have a lot of time that's needed. So you don't want to miss it. So you want to ask these questions about other systems that their system needs to connect with. And then throughout all of this, let them talk. I have that in bold for a reason. You don't want to keep jumping in and saying, oh, we could do this, we could do that. Let that golden silence work for you. Take the notes, stay engaged, keep asking questions, and eventually you'll start getting the lay of the land and figuring out what are the areas of the system that need to be accomplished. Now, this all works better if you can work with someone. So if you're a solo business, this isn't going to work for you. But if you're part of a team or you have a partnership or anything, then working with a colleague works better. And that's because I've found it's very difficult to take coherent notes while I'm trying to say a coherent sentence. So speaking and taking notes sometimes is sort of back and forth. So if you can have one person take notes while the other is talking and then flip it around, sometimes one person is better at talking and then the other person can take notes and really focus themselves on that. So whenever we do this type of discovery phase, we always make sure there's two people most of the time in the conversation. You might guess that I'm pretty good at talking, and I am. So a lot of times I'm the one asking the questions and leading the conversation, but then I have one of my designers taking detailed notes and piping in with questions as well and clarifications. So it's a really good sort of tag team, and you can both focus on uh, getting the best information. Now, sometimes, occasionally, our clients will say, well, but then I'm paying for two people. And I say, yeah, you are. That's part of our process. And it's good that we have extra people on the call, another person on the call, because we're bouncing ideas and it makes the whole project go smoother. If you have someone that complains about that, then I hate to tell you this, but they might be disqualifying themselves as a good customer, because then they're focused on the hourly rate and how much things are costing now, as opposed to the quality and the overall cost of the system later. So we always try to find customers that understand that they want the best overall result, as opposed to being worried about the hourly costs. Any questions on this so far?
Yeah, I have a question.
Hmm.
Yes. Regarding the last point where you have a colleague compare notes later, personally for me, it's not possible to have two people working with me on the same project. So what I usually do is send a summary or a meeting minutes to the customer after I talk to them. Do you think it also worked? Not a perfect alternative, but what's your opinion?
Yeah, actually, you're thinking ahead for me, because I do have a note about following up from a meeting to say, here's what we discussed and here's what we decided. I think that's a really good point. I don't think it takes the place of having two people in the call so that you can talk and take notes at the same time. I will tell you that a workaround for that, if I'm on a call and I am talking to a customer and I'm learning as fast as I can, right? This is where your brain has to really engage, and you're taking in a lot of information. I will, again, remember, silence is not a bad thing. So I will say, I'll pick on George again. I'll say, hey, George, I'm just actually going to take a few notes. And so, hold on a second, I'm taking some notes. What I do is I tell the person I'm talking to that the reason I'm looking down from the video camera or there's silence on the phone line is because I'm taking notes. And instead of that being an awkward thing, where it's like, oh no, now there's silence, it's a sign of respect. Because if I'm talking to George and he's the client, and I say, hey, George, just hold on a second, I'm going to take some notes right here. So I'll be back in a second. George is, what George is thinking? He's not thinking, oh, why can't Armen keep talking to me? I hate silence. What he's thinking is, I hope, wow, Armen really heard me and he wants to make sure he gets it right. So he's respecting my words so much that he's saying, hold on a second, I need to get down all this amazing wisdom. So if you can only work with a client as one person, which I understand that that's sometimes the way it is, then don't be afraid of saying, hold on a second, I'm writing some notes, because honestly, very few people can talk in a coherent way and take notes at the exact same time. So give it the respect it deserves and the time it deserves, and I think your client will respect you for that. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, it's very
Okay,
helpful. Thank you.
good. Good. And we'll talk more about follow-ups from meetings in a minute.
I have a couple of questions, Armen.
Yeah.
First one, and you kind of alluded to it, but how does any of this change in person versus over a Zoom call or a Teams call in these days?
That's a great question. I have found that even before the pandemic, we started doing almost everything by video meeting. I mean, in the old days, it was by phone meeting. I mean, I have stories of projects where we did a $250,000 project and I never knew what the person looked like and never saw them or met them until much later. So it can be done by just hearing people by voice. But I'm a big fan of keeping video on during face-to-face, one-to-one or small group meetings, because you can pick up so much from expressions and gestures, or even just holding up a hand like I have a question instead of trying to interrupt a sentence. But how it's different, I would say that the communication in person, when we can get back to that, and if it's a luxury that you're close by with your customers, then that is actually the best. I always like to say, the best meetings are when everyone can smell the same whiteboard markers. You're in there and you're dealing with it together. You can be on the same whiteboard or around a table, maybe even having a little bit of a treat like some muffins or some coffee or whatever, because humans are really social creatures and we like to break bread together. And so having a bit of something to eat or drink while you're with people is a very good connecting a way to connect. But it isn't always possible, not even during normal times, unlike what we've had in the last year, but even just traveling, like the idea of traveling across the country to just do a discovery meeting, it happens and we've definitely done it, or people travel to us, but it isn't always possible. These days, even across town, people don't want to drive across Seattle. We have a bunch of bridges that get in the way. It's terrible. So we often do video meetings even when we're just across town. So as far as how it's different, I would say that it's basically the same, to answer your question, but you just have to be much more engaged in leaving the silences so that they can be filled, because you won't be able to read your audience as well on video, or certainly without video. So you have to do kind of what I'm doing, which is occasionally stop. Now, by the way, I always feel funny about silence and being open and all that, because realize that this is a presentation. So I'm giving a presentation, so I'm going to do 95% of the talking. But what I'm talking about, the topic I'm talking about, is when you're one-on-one and it has to be more of a dialogue, and you actually should be doing more of the listening. So it's different from a presentation. I always feel a little self-conscious because I'm saying, yeah, make sure you shut up every once in a while and listen. And of course, I'm not doing much of that at all, except when I'm asking for questions. But realize it's a totally different thing. It's not a presentation. I think some consultants go in thinking it's a presentation, and that's a huge mistake. If you go in to talk to a client to find out their requirements and you're thinking you're going to have to do all the talking, then you've got it completely wrong. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize.
Thank you. Second question is, how do you handle getting in a certain way into the discussion and realizing that the person or people that need to be on the conversation aren't there?
Oh,
if that happens.
That does happen sometimes, and yes, I will cover that a little bit in a future slide. Thank you for the question. That I'll talk a little bit more about that, about who the decision makers are or the subject matter experts. Great. And then the last point on this slide is, the old adage that, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So don't be that hammer looking for a nail. Stay open. And I will tell you this, if you're hungry and you need business, then everything's going to start looking like a nail. In other words, if let's say what you do is you're an access developer, as we are, because that's this group. Well, if everything looks like an access application to you, it may not be. Like, there might be times when you need a web application because that's just a better fit. And if you don't do web applications, let's say, then I would suggest that don't say, well, access can solve this problem, because it isn't the right fit. We all love access and it's an amazing product, but it isn't for everything. So if you do something else, then you have that expertise, then you can bring that up. But even if you don't have the expertise, then you can say, I will help you find a good developer that does, you know, such and such. Let's say it's a web application. Maybe it's a hybrid application. You can say, well, some of this will be in Access, and then this other part should be on the web. But what I'm saying is that really try your best. And I know you might have lean times and you might need to pay that mortgage or that rent or those groceries, but it is not a good idea in the long haul to try to be everything to everybody. You have to choose the ones that fit the types of systems that you can build. And I know that's hard to say, but sometimes you have to be able to say no and pass it off to somebody else. And karma works really well, because if you pass off work to other people, they will eventually pass off work to you, and it can be a wider community. This slide's called Whoa. Here's what sometimes happens. You start talking to a customer or some clients and about their system that they finally decided to do, and they start requirement dumping. And this happens a lot, and I'm sure people on this call have experienced this in one way or another. So what happens is they haven't ever had the ability to talk to a developer for years sometimes, and they've been suffering with this old system, and now you come along and they get to tell you about all their hopes and dreams, and they will dump everything on you. And so what we have to do is start guiding that process and remembering always, and I always say this, phase one should be as small as possible, but no smaller. I'm actually paraphrasing a famous person when I say that. Albert Einstein said something to the effect of, I'm sure I'm paraphrasing, but he said, you know, the solution should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. And so that was his funny way of saying, you know, it has to fit the bill, but it shouldn't have anything extra. And so that's what we always talk about for phase one. And so what we do is we say, okay, that sounds like a great requirement that it automatically update your whatever system, but does that need to happen on day one? Can we deliver it in the future? So then you record it as a wish list. So here's the thing, you get all these requirements through this discovery phase, and you decide which ones have to be there on day one. And I always say the word day one so they understand I'm being very deliberate and specific. The day we turn on your system, does that feature need to be in it? And I encourage all of us to find features that do not need to be there on day one, and we'll add them to what we call the phase two list or the wish list. This helps us focus our attention on the things that really need to happen, and it helps us build future business for ourselves. The reason we like phase one to be as small as possible is because one is they'll get it sooner, so they'll have something they can use sooner and it's helpful for them. But also, I'm telling you, people think that their requirements are prioritized correctly, but I'll tell you what, when they start using phase one of the system, what they thought was going to be the very next thing they wanted to do turns out not to be important, and something else they didn't even think of turns out to be important. So you're going to adjust the priorities of phase two after they get hands on phase one for a while. So has anyone had that experience where you ended up adding a feature at the very beginning and it turned out not to be that important?
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is the thing that we're trying to guard against when we are saying, can we make phase one as small as possible? We like to say, let's just knock phase one out of the park. You guys will love it. Let's make it big enough to be useful to you, but small enough to get done as quickly as possible. All right, let's talk about design. Remember in one of my first slides, I said, here are all the things we have to do in software development. And after discovering requirements, I said we have to design, like we have to do sketches and functional specs. Humans want to design. So let's talk about the difference between a requirement and design. And now, so what I like to say is, what is a requirement? It's what the system will do, not how it will do it. And I have to continue to remind my developers and even myself that this is the way to think about it. If you say what the system will do, you're basically making a checklist, and you don't have to get into how it will do it. And what happens is that we love to design. You guys, I love to design. You talk to me about some software or some problem, my inclination is going to be to get up to the whiteboard and start sketching out what the screen will look like. And what I'm asking us all to do is resist that temptation. What we want to do is understand that a screen will exist. We need to do something with the customer list or an individual customer or an order or whatever it is that you're tracking in this system, but we don't need to design how it will look or how it will operate. And the reason I say that is because the whole point of requirements definition is to estimate the rest of the project. And you do not need to estimate the rest of the project. You don't need to design what the screen will actually look like, where this field will go above this other field or over to the right, or how long will the field be or whatever. You don't need to do all that to get a rough estimate of the entire project. So you're just wasting time if you're designing during requirements. So if you are tempted to start sketching out what a screen or report will look like, I have news for you. You may be in design, and your customer should only be paying for discovery. And by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but we treat the discovery phase as a totally payable, chargeable activity with our customer. We estimate it. We say right up front, the discovery phase will take, I'll make up a number, 50 hours. It'll cost you this much money. That 50 hours will result in those 3 documents I talked about earlier: the screen design, the screen flow, not design, the screen flow, the database diagram, and the project plan. And importantly, it will not include sketches of screens. Sometimes for a larger project, we'll do a visual mock-up of a screen just to show, kind of whet the appetite to show what it might look like, but we don't get into detailed design. So watch out for that. So here's an example. Here's an example of what the system will do. The clients will have the ability to reset their own password when they forget it. That is a requirement, right? The clients can do this thing and reset their own password. That's a requirement. This is a how. The client will click the forgot password link. Okay, now we're talking about a link on a login page. The system will send them an email. That's definitely how it's going to happen, with a unique hashed URL. Oh boy, now we're getting technical. That's really how. And then it's going to display another page, and then they're going to type in their password twice. Again, we're adding more requirements of how it's going to work. And then there's going to be a strength meter, and the password has to match, and then it's going to be changed, and then they'll be redirected to oh my gosh, you guys, that is design. You should not be doing that during requirements. Requirements are like shopping lists when you go to the store. I need to get soup and bread and eggs. If you come home with some soup and some bread and some eggs, you've met your requirements. You do not need to talk about where to find the soup and what kind of soup and blah, 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 unless it's an actual requirement, but you don't need to get in all the specifics of what's in the soup. You either brought soup home or you didn't. Think about the requirements page as that checklist. That document, at the end of the project, you should be able to go back and look at your requirements and say, yep, yep, and yep, I did all of those things. I didn't talk about how I did them. So the more detail you put in about how you do it at the beginning of the project, the more difficult it will be to decide whether you met all the requirements, because things like this change. They might decide that they don't need a strength meter, but if you put it in the requirements, now you have this check mark thing that you're like, now you have to explain why you didn't do it at the end of the project, as opposed to just saying they'll have the ability to reset their password. Think of it as the system will. Our statements for requirements are often the system will support this. The system will allow the user to do that. And that is just simple, straight facts of what the system will be able to do. Any questions on this concept?
Yeah, I have a question on the example that you just gave here.
Mm-hmm.
So the what is something like what you have here, and then I actually don't understand why we need to know about the what at the very first stage of the project, for example.
So you don't understand like the concept of what the system needs to do.
So when you write here what, it's like a checklist of what the system need to do, and you are saying that we don't worry about how to do it at this stage. Is that
At this
correct?
stage, that's correct. Yes. What we're trying to do during requirements discovery is we're trying to understand think of it as a checklist of the scope of the system. So this is an example that's in many systems where they need to be able to reset a password themselves instead of asking an administrator to do it. So modern systems allow you to reset your password when you forget it. I'm using this as an example just because so many systems have this. I'm using it as an example. So I'm saying you need to identify all the features that the system will have, but not the details of how the system will deliver that feature. Does that help?
Yes, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, now there was a question earlier about how do you know when the wrong person, or what do you do when the wrong person's in the room? And I like this slide to be called, who writes the checks? Yes, some people still pay by check, unfortunately. We still get paper checks. So that's just an expression. Basically, who authorized the payments? Who authorizes the budget? So if you don't have approval for the overall project yet, you need to find out how to make that project happen. It may not be for the person, it may not be that the person you're talking to has the approval to do that. So you can ask, are you the decision maker? And I often sometimes say right out, like at the very beginning of the project, I'll be talking to my client and I'll say, I'm going to pick on George again. So George, to go forward with the rest of this project, we're doing requirements discovery right now. That's great. But to go forward with the overall project, are you going to make that decision, or is like, do you have like management or something like that? You don't have to say like, George, are you allowed to make this decision, or do you have a boss or whatever? Just say like, are you the decision maker, or is somebody else going to be involved? George will sometimes say, oh no, it's my choice, it's my decision. But more commonly, he'll say, well, I need to run it past my management, or we have a board that needs to, for this kind of expenditure, I need to get approval from the board, or whatever. So you find out who it is, and then he says, oh, well, actually, our president is Sally, and she approves any expenditures of this level. I go, okay, great, Sally. Okay, so what I do is, with George's permission, I say, hey, would you mind if I drop Sally an email or call her and just fill her in on what we're working on, and ask her what would they like to see in this system to help to have it make sense. Now, this is this sometimes feels too direct to people. They go, George is the one I'm working with. Like, why? Like, I'm a little worried about, going over his head or whatever. You know what? It's not like that. George isn't in trouble. What you're doing is you're saying, look, I want to make you look good. So can we have a meeting with your boss or whoever it is that's making the decision, so that I can answer any questions that they might have, and ask them a question like this: what kind of benefits do they want to see out of the system? Because I got news for you guys. If you please George with all the system things that he wants, that doesn't matter at all, because he cannot approve the budget. He's going to have to then go to Sally and say, Sally, there's this great project and this vendor can do the rest of this system after they've done this discovery. And I think we should go forward. And Sally will be like, well, what about my pet peeve? What are you going to do for the thing that I hate about our current systems? And George might say, oh man, I never even brought that up because it wasn't on my radar. Does that make sense? So now I'm going to talk to Sally directly. And she might say, I want better employee morale, or I want less frustration or wasted time, or I want people to spend time on more important things. Our customer service is bad. I want to make sure we have better customer service. I want more sales. I want to avoid mistakes, because mistakes cost us money and they cost us, reputation. I'm worried about security, or a huge one, which I left toward the end, business continuity risk. What that means is we have somebody in the organization where all of this information is in their head, and we are suffering from the lottery problem. I like to say the lottery problem instead of getting hit by a bus. If this person, this key person, wins the lottery and doesn't show up for work the next day, I don't know how our systems are going to run because everything is in their head and nobody else knows it. Well, what we like to say is, we can put all that knowledge, that institutional and system knowledge, into the system. And then that way you can train new people much faster and easier. And it doesn't all have to be resting on that one person. I'm telling you that the CEO of the company or the CFO or anyone in the C-suite is going to sleep better at night if they know that their key processes are systematized instead of in somebody's noggin. So business continuity is one of the huge ones on this list. So that's what we try to bring to the table to say we'll be able to add to or to reduce that risk. Now, if Sally, the CEO, tells you what they want, and by the way, this one that says less frustration, that doesn't seem like a really important thing to a lot of people, but that is actually what a CEO told me one time. She just said, my people get frustrated working with the systems we have, and I don't want them to be frustrated. I'm like, awesome. So what I did is I put her exact word in the proposal for the rest of the system. Remember, we're doing the discovery phase right now, which might be only a dozen hours or 50 hours or whatever it takes. But the real project is where the money is. That's where they're going to have to make a big investment, and somebody's going to have to decide to do that. So why not put the exact words that the CEO told you right into that executive summary at the top of that proposal? So in that case, what I did is I said, ABC company wants their employees to be less frustrated with using their systems. And I just used the exact word that she told me because she gave me a clue of what she wanted to see the system do. So this is, again, going back to repeat back to people the words they tell you, because they choose those words for a reason. And it would not be a good strategy on your part to ignore those words and use different words because you think they're better. Use the words they tell you because that's what they want. Any questions on this?
Yeah, I have a question. So I have so many questions because I find this very, very relevant to what some of my projects I've been working on. So I'm a young guy in my company, and my fear is that when I talk to them about the what you're talking here, um, I'm afraid that I may say it in a way that sounds like I'm teaching them what to do, which is not good. Do you have an advice for me on that one?
Yeah, I would go back to the earlier slides where I was talking about, do more listening. You can do listening, you can listen, especially if you have less experience and you're trying to come up to speed with your customers. And by the way, whenever I say customers, I mean internal customers at your company or external companies, other companies. So whenever I say customer, I don't mean like, it doesn't always have to be a paying customer that's paying you or your company to do this. It could be somebody internal to your same company. They're still your customer. So when you're talking to your customer and you want to make sure you're not coming across like you're telling them how to do their business, I would just say go back to listening. Go back to asking questions and listening. And then you could say questions like to your point, you don't want to tell them what to do or say that you know it all, but you could say something like, well, if the system did this for you, would that be helpful? So turn a suggestion into a question. And that can soften it a lot and not make it seem like you're trying to tell them what to do, but rather making suggestions and seeing if that sounds good. And if they say, yeah, that would be great if the system did that, then you say, okay, good. I'm going to take a note and add that to the requirements. Or if they say, no, that doesn't really matter, then go, oh, thank you. Okay, that clarifies it, and then move on. Does that help?
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we're talking about closing the loop, and this comes back to a question that came up earlier about what do you do after a meeting? So every time I have a phone call, I always if we decide anything important, if it's just a phone call where it's nothing really major, then I don't do this. But if you have a phone call to decide on something, then I always email a follow-up to confirm. And by the way, everybody is using Teams and chat and all kinds of other ways to communicate. But for something that's important, I like documenting it in an email, because email is still sort of the best repository that's searchable, that you can go back and prove that on a certain date and time. And I know we're trying not to cover our butts here, but I'm just to know that we can document when something was decided. I still use email. The younger people that I know think email is a bit old-fashioned, but I still think it's best to document important things and place them on a date and time. So for a quick communication that I think is sort of more ephemeral, I would say you just use Teams chat or text or whatever you want, but not for important decisions. So we follow up to confirm what was discussed and decided. So I would say it's like something like, "Hi, Sally, I had a great phone call. I wanted to confirm what we decided on the phone today. Insert decision here." In other words, we decided to leave out of phase one the whole interface to, automatic interface to Microsoft Dynamics, right? That's a major decision, because Sally may not remember in 6 months that we decided not to do that thing. So I like documenting it in an email just to confirm that we've made the decision. And by the way, I don't leave it open-ended. I don't say, "Hey, Sally, can you reply to confirm?" What I say is, "Let me know if there's anything wrong with that statement," because Sally is busy. So what I'm doing is I'm informing, I'm not asking. So here's what I heard. Here's what we decided. Let me know if I got any of that wrong. And then then silence is fine. If she does not reply, she's a busy person. I'm not worried about it. What you don't want to do is hold up a project asking for an answer on something when you think you already know the answer. Just say what you think you know, and then say, "Tell me if you know anything different." We also document questions and answers. So a lot of times in projects, we will document a question like this one: "Can someone else in the company initiate a work order or a quote besides a salesperson?" And notice that this one was the 198th question. So this was a big project that we did years back. And then the question is for Alan. So Alan is like, he's the person that we think is going to answer. And then look, a whole month later, Alan finally got back to us and said, or we, tracked down the answer. And yes, the tech department often enters orders or quotes for sales or for internal orders for testing purposes. Well, oh, sorry, sorry, I misspoke. That was due on the 6th and it was resolved a day before. So sometimes we put a due date, like we need to know the answer by this date, otherwise it's going to slow down our project. And then it was resolved by who we predicted. It was resolved by Alan. This is a nice document to keep track of all the decisions that have happened over the course of a project. So I said we document decisions by email, but sometimes we also have a formal document like this. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a fancy database or anything. A lot of times we just use this in a Word document where there's a table and you can just build the table up over time of lines of questions and answers. Like I said before, if you're working with a colleague, send your notes to each other after a conversation. This is especially true if you're not used to working with this colleague and you're not really sure what they're hearing and what they're noting. So a lot of times when we're on a call, even though I do most of the talking, I will still take a few notes and I will send those notes to my designer and say, here's my notes. And I don't pretty them up. They're not going to a client. They're going to one of my own team members. So I just stream of consciousness, I just write down notes and I use shorthand or whatever, and I write it all down and I just send that to my colleague and they look at it and they go, "Hey, Armen, like on this 4th item, you said you heard this, but what I heard was that we're not doing that." And I'm like, "Oh, ruh-roh, like we need to resolve this." And then we have a little conversation, and if we're still in disagreement about what we heard, then we can add it to the Q&A and ask the client later and say, "You know what, we're unclear on whether we ended up with including this feature or not. Can you clarify?" And that helps us keep the quality of our information intact. And then we also like to record the main areas that we've discussed so that we can add it to a project status report. One of the things we do throughout a project, usually monthly if it's a large project, is at the end of every month, we say to the client, we send a report that says, here's what we did last month, here's what we're planning to do this next month, and maybe we often include a graph of like, here's how many hours you've budgeted and here's where we are. To kind of show how far through the approved budget we are. But it's hard to do that status report if you don't remember the areas that we discussed over a whole month. So if there's some major things that we've talked about, note them down and record them so that you'll have the material to put in a status report later. Even if you don't do regular status reports, because that's just not your style or it's not what you do, if the customer comes back in a month and says, oh, my boss wants to know what's going on with this project, and now I need something from you, now you have the ready material so that you can put it together into a report and whip it together and then make them look like a hero. So any questions on this?
A quick observation, Armen, if I may.
Please.
I have been making extensive use of Microsoft OneNote as a repository for exactly those kinds of things. I agree with you completely about having to send emails for a number of not even just milestones, but the way that you're talking about emails, I agree completely. But I like putting links into a shared OneNote notebook, and that keeps us from ever having to chase down through long email threads, trying to figure, okay, well, what was the process along the way? How did we get to this decision? That was one observation. I'd like to know what you think about that. But also, a little earlier on, you talked about charging for the discovery phase. And I know that there's a temptation to say, well, this is business development on my part, so I'm either not going to charge fully, or sometimes you might feel like not charging at all while you're developing requirements. But then if you don't, then you could find yourself leaving the client with what essentially could become a spec for a bid that they would put out. You're basically helping them build a bid product. So.
Oh, those are, yeah, you're speaking close to my heart now on that second point. On the first point, I love OneNote. I use OneNote is my go-to quick note-taking device. If it's an internal project, then sharing a OneNote and sharing it all together is a good idea. Within the team, I would say that sharing it, I don't know if you meant this, but I would say sharing it with the customer is probably not the best idea, because they could change things that are already there and it's hard to tell who's done what without tracking. But yeah, I love OneNote. OneNote, you can also turn on the recorder, the voice recorder in OneNote, and actually have the recording of the conversation. If it's open, if you have it on your speaker, I mean, if you can hear it. If it's on a headset, it's a little harder. But you can record a conversation out in the ambient air in OneNote, and it'll synchronize with your notes, which is an amazing feature. But yeah, I agree with whatever note taking you can do it. And then I agree with you of documenting important things with email, because it's searchable later. Also, especially if it's outside the company and you want to have it sort of in the record. But yeah, agreed. Huge OneNote fan. The second point, yeah, boy, don't get me started. I've talked to so many developers who think they have to toil away on some kind of project requirements document free of charge because they want to land the business. And yes, I agree with you that sometimes that can be used to go out to your competitors and say, well, this is what we do, and I just got a bunch of free work from this developer. But even to a bigger point, I would say that devalues your time. If you give time away to do a bunch of work, then basically what you've taught your customer is that time is not very important and your expertise is not very valuable. And I think that the expertise during the requirements definition phase is the highest expertise. It's actually way more important than knowing how to program software, because there's a lot of programmers out there, and hopefully we're all good programmers or aspire to be good programmers. But even beyond that is knowing what to program and how to meet the requirements of a company's what their needs are and how to alleviate that pain. And if I were, we charge a single shop rate for most projects. Like we charge the same rate of whether we're constructing code or testing or requirements or whatever. But if I did have tiered pricing, I would charge the most per hour on the requirements definition up front. So to give that time away is just, to me, completely backwards. There are industries, though, where it is routinely a matter of course that people spend hours and days putting together responses to RFPs, and that's just part of the industry. But I'm happy to say that custom software development tends to not be part of that. So thank goodness we don't have to have a whole team of people in my company just putting together specs and understanding requirements in great detail so that we can respond to these requests for proposals. I just don't want to play that game. In fact, I hardly ever respond to RFPs because I just don't like the whole structure. I wrote a whole article on our website that you could find about why we rarely respond to RFPs, but it's for that same reason that you're bringing up. And that is they're asking for a bunch of work and everyone is going to duplicate their work, everyone who wants to respond, and it's just a waste of time. And it devalues it devalues that, the nature of that work, and I don't like it. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And if I may just throw one last thing, maybe this isn't part of today's conversation, but I usually find that during requirements discovery, it's a good time to start thinking about what kind of data mapping, what kind of data conversion, maybe even data cleansing is going to be involved in the project, because it's easy to have a successful project and then basically lose it all or more when data conversion doesn't work as hoped.
Oh, data conversion. Again, another thing not to get me started on. Data conversion is one of the worst parts of a project for this reason. If you do it perfectly, nobody knows a thing. It's such an invisible thing. Users expect the new system to come up and be running, and of course all their old data is in the system, and it took an inordinate amount of effort to make it happen that way. So that's something that you need to consider, and we always make sure that we have data conversion as one of our line items in the estimate. So it's a really good point. Dawn, did you have a question?
I did. Well, I just wanted to jump in as far as closing the loop and make another endorsement for OneNote. I use it extensively. I do it to take notes when I'm speaking to my customers. And I use a format for my notes that has a column for topic, a column for the discussion, and a third column for next steps so that you can record, Joe is going to get us this, or Bob is going to get us that, or Dawn is going to provide an estimate for this, that, or whatever. And if you don't share a notebook with your client, you can actually email the page to them.
Yes.
And you can actually create the page from your calendar invitation. So it's got a list of everyone who was invited. You can check off who was there. So yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. You're teaching me about OneNote. I love it. Yeah. OneNote is there's so many layers to OneNote. It is one of my favorite products. Like I really just love it. And you're teaching me to start looking at some other features. So thank you.
Yeah. So if you have an appointment on your calendar, there's a button to send it to OneNote, and you can put it where you want, and you can add your grid, which my grid is always topic, discussion, next steps, and take notes during the meeting. And then I just clean that up after the meeting and email it to everyone on the meeting.
That's a fantastic, thank you for that. I'm gonna look into that. I like that. All right, to move on, because I know we're running short on time, and these are all really great questions and comments. Thank you. There are weird requirements. That's a real technical term that I just threw in there. Handling weird requirements. Sometimes your client will ask for something that's not a good idea. Like if you were building a house, the client would say, what would be really handy is to have a bathroom right in the middle of the living room. And you're like, not a great idea. So how do you handle that? Because sometimes maybe you don't have that much experience, or you don't really want to tell them they're wrong, But what do you do? So what we like to do when we get weird requirements is we research best practices and we show examples. So nobody wants to go against industry best practices. So we don't have to say that's a stupid idea. That's the wrong way to say it. Or we don't even have to say, well, the way we do it is such and such. That's also not a great convincing argument. What we say is, here are the best practices we've discovered that we see in the industry, and here are some examples. So humans don't like to buck the trend, and so that'll probably be enough to convince them that a bathroom right in the middle of the living room is not the best idea. A non-standard system is harder to support. Sometimes people will say, oh, I wanted to do this weird thing. And you go, you know, that's fine. I mean, you could do that, but finding developers that are going to support that is going to be difficult down the road. So we suggest that we not do that. Other times clients ask for things that actually you could think about and it could be exploited to hurt them. So for example, we once had a commission system where the client said, well, we want the salespeople to be able to enter in blah, blah, blah. And it turned out that the thing that the salespeople were entering in would actually increase their commission. Well, I've got news for you. Any behavior that you reward, you will see more of. So if you have a system that encourages or rewards people for doing some kind of behavior that might be a bad behavior, you know, I have bad news, and that is that you will see more of that bad behavior if the system allows it and even rewards it. So sometimes clients ask for things that actually you have to have a bit of a criminal mind and think about how could it be exploited or used incorrectly. So watch out for things like that. These don't come up all the time, and usually the clients will be like, are you kidding? I'd never let my salespeople do that. So it's not a problem. But sometimes they come up with things that you got to be able to think of how it could be misused. Okay, that is the end of my slide deck. I wanted to add the weird requirements at the end there just for fun. I am open for a few more minutes for a little bit of discussion and question. There's my contact info if you want to grab it.